The biting wind howled through the narrow alleyways of Salzburg, carrying with it the scent of burning firewood and distant notes of a violin played by a street musician. Elisa Muller pulled her coat tighter around her and trudged up the icy path leading to her modest flat. Her boots crunched against the frozen ground, the cold sinking through the worn leather into her bones. She paused at the battered postbox, its paint peeling and its hinges creaking mournfully as she pulled it open. Among the usual assortment of bills and leaflets, a single envelope stood out, thick, cream-colored, and sealed with deep crimson wax. A shiver ran down her spine, one that had nothing to do with the cold. Carefully, she broke the seal and unfolded the letter within. Her breath caught as her eyes scanned the flowing handwriting. Dear Elisa, it has been too long. We would be delighted to have you and dear Sophie join us for a family gathering at the Mahler estate this winter. Your presence is requested. Please do not decline. Warm regards, Helga Muller. Elisa stared at the letter, heart pounding. Aunt Helga had not contacted her in nearly 15 years. Their last meeting had ended with harsh words and slammed doors. Yet now, here was an invitation, penned with apparent affection. Mama, what is it? Sophie's small voice brought her back. The little girl's eyes sparkled with curiosity as she tugged at Elisa's coat sleeve. It is an invitation, Elisa murmured, still stunned. To the Mahler estate. Sophie clapped her mittened hands together, her cheeks glowing with excitement. Oh, Mama! We must go. It will be magical, I know it. Elisa hesitated, her mind battling old wounds and fresh hopes. She thought of the grim faces she remembered from her childhood, the echoing hallways and stern whispers. But then she looked down at Sophie, her sweet face full of dreams, and felt her resolve waver. All right, she said softly. We shall go. The next morning, with heavy suitcases and heavier hearts, they boarded a tram that rattled and swayed through the snow-dusted streets. The city fell away behind them, replaced by wide fields blanketed in white and clusters of fir trees burdened with ice. Elisa held Sophie close as they journeyed, gazing out of the frost-laced windows. Memories of the estate flickered through her mind, the grand marble staircase, the cold stone corridors, the endless portraits staring down from the walls. Her stomach twisted into knots. Finally, the tram screeched to a halt near the village on the edge of the Mahler lands. From there, a narrow lane wound its way up a hill, lined with ancient trees whose skeletal branches reached out like gnarled fingers. As they climbed the path, the villa came into view, standing proudly against the gray sky. Its windows glowed warmly, contrasting with the stark whiteness of the surrounding snow. The ivy, usually a lush green in summer, now curled in brittle tendrils around the balconies and stone archways. To Sophie, it must have seemed like a palace out of a storybook. But to Elisa, the house loomed like a silent sentinel, guarding secrets better left undisturbed. When they reached the massive oak door, Elisa hesitated. She could still turn back. They could find a small inn in the village, claim they had been delayed by the weather. But Sophie was already bouncing on her toes, her mitten poised above the brass doorbell. With a small, determined nod, Elisa allowed her daughter to press it. The bell echoed, a low, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the house. A moment later, the door swung open. Aunt Helga stood there, larger than life, her ample frame draped in rich velvet. Her eyes, a piercing blue, fixed on Elisa with an unreadable expression. Elisa, she said, her voice smooth as silk, how good of you to come. She stepped aside, allowing them entry. The air inside was heavy with the scent of pine and polished wood. A fire crackled merrily in the great hearth, but Elisa felt no warmth from it. As they entered the grand hall, more figures emerged. Paumen Klaus, stoic and silent, nodded stiffly. Cousin Greta, once Elisa's childhood playmate, now a stern woman in her 30s, offered a cool smile. Others gathered at the edges, watching. You must be exhausted, Aunt Helga said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. We have prepared a room for you. Elisa murmured a polite thank you, clutching Sophie's hand tighter. The ornate chandeliers overhead gleamed, casting long, intricate shadows that seemed to shift and slither as they moved deeper into the house. Sophie, unbothered, skipped alongside her mother, her innocent eyes wide with wonder. She did not see the fleeting glances exchanged between the family members, nor did she notice the way the doors seemed to close a little too firmly behind them. Elisa saw, and her unease grew. She knew they were not here simply to be welcomed back. There was something more. something hidden beneath the surface smiles and polite words. And she feared they were already in too deep to escape. The first night at the Malheur estate was cloaked in uneasy silence. The great hall, once a place of family celebrations, now seemed to echo with the ghosts of a past Elisa would rather forget. The only sounds were the occasional creaks of old wood and the faint hiss of the wind sneaking through the cracks in the stone. Their assigned room was at the far end of the eastern wing, a place Elisa did not remember ever being allowed to explore as a child. It was smaller than she had expected, the walls lined with heavy drapes and a thick rug muffling their footsteps. Sophie was already twirling around the room, her golden curls bouncing as she marveled at the antique furniture and the fireplace that crackled gently in the corner. "It is like a castle, Mama," she said in awe, running her small hand along the carved oak bedposts. Elisa forced a smile. "Yes, darling. A castle." As Sophie settled into the grand bed, Elisa sat by the window, staring out into the dark. The snow had begun again, thick flakes swirling in the wind, blurring the world outside into a featureless sea of white. She could not shake the feeling that they were being watched. Later that night, long after Sophie had drifted into a peaceful sleep, Elisa woke to a soft sound. A whisper, almost too faint to hear. She sat up, heart pounding, straining her ears. There it was again. A soft murmur, like voices floating through the corridors. Elisa slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Sophie. She wrapped her shawl tightly around her and tiptoed to the door. She pressed her ear against the cold wood. Nothing. Slowly, she opened the door a crack and peered out. The corridor was bathed in moonlight seeping through the high windows, casting long shadows along the floor. She stepped into the hall, her bare feet cold against the stone. The air was heavy, filled with the scent of burning candles and something else, something metallic and sour. The whispering grew louder. Drawn by a force she did not understand, Elisa followed the sound down the hall. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch her, their painted eyes glinting in the low light. She turned a corner and froze. At the far end of the corridor, standing in the shadows, was a figure. Tall, unmoving, cloaked in darkness. Elisa's breath caught in her throat. She took a step back, but the figure did not move. For a moment, they stood there, locked in silent confrontation. Then slowly, the figure stepped into the light. It was Greta. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. "You should not wander at night," Greta said in a low voice. Elisa struggled to find her words. "I heard voices." Greta's eyes darkened. "The walls remember everything. Best to stay in your room." Without another word, Greta turned and disappeared down another corridor, her steps making no sound. Elisa hurried back to her room, her heart hammering. She bolted the door behind her and crawled back into bed, wrapping her arms around Sophie. She lay awake for hours, listening to the whispering that never quite faded away. Morning came with a gray light, barely penetrating the thick curtains of the Malheur estate. Snow piled high against the stone walls outside, and the world seemed wrapped in an endless winter slumber. Elisa barely slept. She moved around the room silently, careful not to disturb Sophie who was still curled under the heavy blankets. Her mind replayed the events of the night, the whispers, Greta's warning, and the chilling presence in the hallway. She needed answers. After breakfast, which consisted of stale bread and bitter coffee served by a different maid, one who never spoke or made eye contact, Elisa decided to explore the mansion while Sophie played near the fireplace. The house was a maze of corridors and sealed doors. Many of the wings were closed off, draped in dusty cloth and forgotten by time. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the ticking of an ancient grandfather clock in the foyer. Elisa wandered aimlessly at first, tracing her hand along the cracked wallpaper, until she found herself in front of an ornate double door she did not recognize. It was slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. She hesitated. The sensible part of her screamed to turn back. But curiosity, that dangerous persistent flame, pushed her forward. Inside was a library. The air was thick with the scent of old parchment and wax. Shelves stretched up to the ceiling, crammed with leather-bound volumes, many of which looked untouched for decades. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light filtering through stained glass windows. In the center of the room stood a massive desk. On it, piles of yellowed papers, some tied with twine, others left loose and curling at the edges. One document caught her eye. It was a letter, written in elegant but hurried handwriting. The ink was faded, but the message was clear. The pact must be honored. The price has already been paid in blood. Elisa's fingers trembled as she set the letter down. A cold dread seeped into her bones. What pact? Whose blood? As she turned to leave, a sharp creak split the air. Someone else was there. A figure stood at the edge of the room, half hidden behind the towering shelves. Elisa's voice caught in her throat. She squinted into the shadows. Who's there? She called, her voice barely above a whisper. No response. Only the sound of breathing. Shallow, raspy, close. She backed away, her heart hammering. The figure did not move, but she could feel its gaze burning into her. She fled the library, the door slamming shut behind her with a deafening thud. Breathless, she pressed her back against the opposite wall, clutching her chest. This house was not just a relic of her family's troubled past. It was alive, humming with secrets and old sorrows, watching her every move. And she was beginning to realize, there were forces here that did not want her to leave. Later that afternoon, as the sun barely skimmed the horizon, casting the estate in eerie gold, Elisa sat by the window, staring out into the lifeless garden. Snow had covered everything, hiding whatever secrets lay beneath. Sophie played quietly on the carpet, lining up her dolls in a neat row. Yet even her innocent laughter felt subdued, as if the house itself had dampened the joy. Elisa could not shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind against the windows made her jump. She tried to distract herself by sorting through old books and letters she had taken from the library earlier. But her mind kept drifting back to the figure she had seen. Who was it? Why did they hide? As evening deepened, she decided she needed to know more. She ventured deeper into the mansion, her footsteps muffled by thick rugs. The upper floors were even colder, and the air grew heavier with every step, as if invisible hands were pushing against her. At the very end of a long hallway, she found a door unlike the others. It was iron-reinforced, bolted, and chained shut. Deep scratches marred the wood, claw marks, desperate and wild. The sight froze Elisa in place. Why would anyone lock a room so brutally? Her hand hovered over the padlock, heart racing. She knew she should turn back, pretend she had never seen it. But once again, curiosity gnawed at her. She needed answers, even if they terrified her. Downstairs in the kitchen, she had noticed an old ring of keys hanging near the pantry. Maybe one of them would fit. She hurried back, the house groaning around her, as if protesting her movements. Finding the ring of keys was easy. Picking the right one was not. She fumbled through the heavy brass keys, finally selecting a large, rusted one that felt cold and heavy in her hand. Back upstairs, she hesitated only a moment before slipping the key into the lock. It turned with a reluctant screech. The chains fell away. Elisa pushed the door open. A gust of freezing air rushed out, carrying the smell of decay and something else, something older, fouler. Inside, the room was empty save for a single item. In the center of the floor, illuminated by a narrow shaft of moonlight, was a wooden cradle. It rocked back and forth, ever so slightly, though no wind stirred. Elisa stepped closer, every instinct screaming at her to run. She peered into the cradle. Empty. But as she leaned in, a faint sound rose from the walls. A soft, broken lullaby, sung by a voice too sorrowful to belong to the living. The cradle rocked harder. Suddenly, cold fingers brushed the back of her neck. Elisa whirled around, but no one was there. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Trapped. Heart hammering, breath clouding in the icy air, she stumbled backwards. And then she saw it. Scrawled on the wall, hidden by shadows, a message written in what looked like dark, dried stains. The child must not wake. Trapped inside the cold, dark room, Elisa's breath quickened. She pressed against the door, pushing with all her strength, but it would not budge. It was as if someone, was holding it shut from the other side. The soft, broken lullaby continued, seeping from the very walls. Shivering, Elisa turned back toward the cradle. It had stopped rocking. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. Then she heard it. A faint scratching sound. Not coming from the door. Not from the window. But from underneath the floorboards. Elisa's mouth went dry. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if something was trying to claw its way up from the depths below. She stumbled backward, eyes darting around the dim room, searching for any way out. Suddenly, from the far corner, a section of the wooden floor shifted. Dust puffed into the air. A small, jagged hole appeared. From the hole, a tiny hand emerged. Pale. Thin. Fingers trembling. Elisa gasped and stumbled back until her spine hit the cold stone wall. The hand grasped the floorboards weakly, struggling to pull something unseen from below. Before she could react, the cradle moved again, this time violently, as if an invisible force had struck it. The air grew thick, almost impossible to breathe. A low, guttural growl echoed from the cradle, a sound no human could make. Elisa squeezed her eyes shut, whispering desperate prayers under her breath. When she opened them again, the hand was gone. The hole had vanished. The cradle stood still, as if nothing had happened. But the message on the wall had changed. New words, freshly scrawled beneath the old ones, dripping dark and wet. She is already waking. Panic surged through Elisa's chest. She had to get out. Nah. She slammed her fists against the door, screamed until her throat burned. At last, something on the other side shifted. The door creaked open. Elisa did not wait to see who, or what, had released her. She sprinted down the corridor, barely noticing the paintings lining the walls. Yet something was wrong. The faces in the portraits had changed. Every painted eye followed her movements, their expressions twisted into grotesque sneers. The once regal figures now looked decayed, as if the rot in the house had seeped into them. She reached Sophie's room, flung the door open. Sophie sat on the bed, staring out the window. "Come, darling, we have to go," Elisa gasped. But Sophie did not move. She just pointed toward the snowy garden. Elisa's gaze followed her daughter's trembling finger. There, standing among the bare trees, was the figure she had seen the night before. Closer now. Much closer. A woman in a tattered dress, hair hanging wet and heavy around her face, eyes black and hollow. And in her arms, she cradled something small. Something that squirmed. Something that cried with a voice that chilled Elisa's blood. It was a baby. But not a living one. Its skin was gray and cracked, its mouth stretched open in an endless silent scream. The woman lifted her head. Even from the window, Elisa could hear the hiss that escaped her lips. A single word. A name. Sophie. Elisa snatched Sophie into her arms and ran. Her heart thundered in her chest as she raced through the winding corridors of the mansion, every shadow seeming to reach for her. Behind her, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, making the walls tremble. She did not dare look back. The air grew colder with every step. A thick mist began to gather around her ankles, swirling like living smoke. As she turned a corner, she stumbled into a vast hall. Unlike the crumbling, decaying parts of the mansion, this room was strangely pristine. The walls were lined with towering mirrors. Dozens of them. Each mirror reflected not only her image but something else. Something darker. In each reflection, she saw herself holding Sophie. But behind her, creeping closer, was the figure of the woman in the tattered dress. In some mirrors, the woman was inches away. In others, she was smiling, baring rows of sharp, broken teeth. Elisa's breathing grew ragged. She tried to find the exit, but every direction was a maze of reflections, confusing and disorienting. And then, the lights began to flicker. The mirrors shimmered, as if the surface between glass and reality was thinning. From the corner of her eye, Elisa saw movement. She turned sharply. In one of the mirrors, the woman was no longer just a reflection. She was stepping forward, out of the glass, one hand stretched toward Sophie. Elisa screamed and sprinted forward, crashing blindly through the maze. Mirrors shattered around her, shards raining down like deadly snow. But there was no escape. Everywhere she turned, more mirrors. More twisted versions of herself. And more glimpses of the creature, stalking her through the labyrinth. Finally, she spotted a narrow door on the far side of the hall. Gathering every ounce of strength, Elisa bolted toward it. She could feel the air behind her shift, as if cold fingers were reaching out to snatch her away. She burst through the door and slammed it behind her. The sound of her pounding heart was the only thing she could hear. Panting, she pressed her back against the door, clutching Sophie tightly. The room she had entered was different. It was small, almost like a forgotten servant's quarters. Dust lay thick over everything, and a single broken lantern swung from the ceiling. Elisa lowered Sophie to the ground. Her daughter stared at her, wide-eyed but silent. For a moment, Elisa allowed herself to believe they were safe. But then she noticed it. On the far wall, drawn in what looked like ash or soot, were more words. Words that hadn't been there before. The mirror is only the beginning. Elisa closed her eyes, fighting the tears threatening to spill. This was not just a haunted house. It was a trap. A prison. And she and Sophie were trapped deeper than she had ever imagined. Outside the cracked window, the wind howled like a chorus of voices. Whispers clawed at the edges of her mind. Sophie tugged at her sleeve. "Mama," she said in a small voice, "she's coming." Elisa turned her head slowly toward the door. The handle was rattling. The whispers became louder, furious, desperate. The broken lantern overhead flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Then came the sound of footsteps. Soft at first. Then louder. Slow. Purposeful. Coming straight for them. The door creaked open with a slow, grating sound. Elisa clutched Sophie to her chest, backing into the deepest shadow of the small room. A pale hand, skeletal and trembling, emerged through the gap in the door. Long, cracked nails scraped across the wood as the creature slowly pulled itself inside. Elisa knew they could not stay. Summoning what little courage she had left, she scanned the room. Her gaze fell on a hatch in the floor, half concealed beneath a rotting carpet. Without hesitation, she yanked the carpet aside and pulled at the rusted iron ring. The hatch groaned open, releasing a gust of foul, icy air from the darkness below. Elisa lowered Sophie carefully down first, then climbed after her, pulling the hatch closed just as the thing in the doorway let out a wailing cry. They descended into darkness. Only the distant sound of whispers guided them. The cellar was vast. Bigger than the house above, sprawling out in every direction like a maze of stone walls and arched corridors. Their footsteps echoed off the damp stone floor. The whispers grew louder, weaving around them like unseen threads. Sometimes Elisa could almost make out words. "Help us. Don't leave. She knows you're here." Sophie clung to Elisa's hand tightly, her small body trembling. The air was so cold it burned their lungs with every breath. Suddenly, a faint light flickered to life down one of the corridors. It was a lantern, swinging from a hook on the wall, casting long, quivering shadows. Elisa moved toward it, driven by desperate hope. As they approached, they found an old wooden sign nailed to the wall beneath the lantern. The words carved into it were barely legible. "Vault of Memories." Elisa frowned. She could feel it in her bones. This was important. Maybe the only chance they had. But the moment they crossed under the lantern's light, the whispers exploded into shrieks. The walls themselves seemed to pulse and groan. From the far end of the corridor, something began to emerge. Not a person. Not even a ghost. It was a mass of shadows, swirling, twisting, forming vague, nightmarish shapes. Hands, faces, mouths wide in silent screams. It rushed toward them, swallowing the light as it came. Elisa grabbed Sophie and ran, her footsteps slapping hard against the wet stone. Every corner turned revealed another endless hallway. Every door she tried was locked or led nowhere. The creature was gaining on them, its many mouths stretching wider, reaching with tendrils of smoke. Then ahead she saw it. A door. An ancient, iron-bound door set into the stone wall, half hidden by hanging chains. She bolted for it. Just as she reached it, she felt something brush her shoulder. Cold, burning like ice. She shoved the door open with a cry and tumbled inside, pulling Sophie with her. The door slammed shut on its own. Silence fell. For a moment, all she could hear was her own ragged breathing. Then she realized where they were. This was not just a vault. It was a tomb. Rows of stone coffins lined the walls, each one carved with strange symbols and names long forgotten. At the far end of the room stood a pedestal. And on that pedestal, wrapped in chains, was a single ancient book. Sophie tugged at Elisa's sleeve again, whispering, "Mama, it's in the book." Elisa swallowed hard. Whatever was happening in this house, whatever held them here, it was connected to that book. And the only way to survive was to open it. But as she took a step forward, the tomb's heavy door shuddered violently behind them. The darkness outside was not gone. It was waiting. And it was angry. Elisa stepped closer to the chained book, each step echoing off the stone like a warning drum. The air around the pedestal crackled with unseen energy, making the tiny hairs on her arms stand on end. Sophie clung to her skirt, whispering urgently, "Be careful, Mama. It's watching." Elisa reached out cautiously. The chains were cold, far colder than the damp air of the tomb. When her fingers brushed them, she felt a jolt shoot up her arm, like a whisper that wasn't meant to be heard. Still, she gritted her teeth and pulled. The chains resisted at first, groaning under the strain, but then one by one they began to unravel, slithering down the pedestal like dead serpents. The moment the last chain hit the ground, the tomb trembled. From the shadows between the coffins, ghostly figures began to emerge. Men, women, children, their faces hollow, their eyes wide with eternal sorrow. They didn't speak. They simply watched. Elisa's hand hovered over the book. It was bound in cracked black leather, its cover marked with a strange symbol, a circle enclosing a twisted tree, its roots and branches entangled. There was no title, just the weight of centuries pressing against her mind. She opened it. The pages were covered in dense writing, in a language she didn't recognize. The letters seemed to move slightly, shifting and twisting when she tried to focus on them. But then on the very first page, a single name burned bright among the strange script. Amelia Rauch. Elisa gasped. She had seen that name carved above the hearth in the kitchen upstairs. The supposed original owner of the house. Sophie pointed at the page, her voice barely a breath. "She's still here." Before Elisa could ask what she meant, a thunderous crash shook the tomb. The heavy iron door behind them splintered inward, revealing the swirling mass of darkness outside. But this time it was different. From within the shadows, a figure began to form. Taller, sharper, almost human. It wore a tattered black dress that fluttered despite the still air. Its face was hidden beneath a veil, but its hands were unmistakable, skeletal, yet grasping with the hunger of the living. Elisa stumbled back. The figure moved with jerky, unnatural steps, every movement twitching like a marionette cut free from its strings. The ghostly spectators lining the walls began to murmur, a sound like dry leaves brushing together. Sophie tugged Elisa's hand. "Mama, you have to read it." The creature was closing in, the air growing thick with the smell of earth and rot. Elisa's hands trembled as she turned the page, searching desperately. She found a passage highlighted in blood-red ink. It spoke of binding and unbinding, of memories stolen and souls trapped, of a ritual unfinished. The final line stood out sharply, almost glowing. "Speak the true name to break the chains." Elisa looked back at the approaching figure. Somewhere, deep inside, she knew, this wasn't just a ghost. This was Amelia Rauch herself. And she had never left. As the creature stretched a hand toward Sophie, Elisa screamed the name aloud. "Amelia Rauch." The reaction was immediate and violent. The tomb walls groaned. The air split with a deafening crack. The shadows recoiled as if struck by an invisible force. The figure staggered, its veil lifting slightly to reveal a glimpse of a face, pale, ravaged, endlessly weeping. It shrieked, a sound so raw that Elisa had to cover Sophie's ears. The coffins rattled in their alcoves. The specters along the walls bowed their heads. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything went still. The creature stood frozen, trembling, as if held by invisible chains. For a heartbeat, Elisa dared to hope it was over. But Sophie shook her head. "No, Mama. It's not finished yet." And from the far end of the tomb, another door began to creak open, not by human hand, but as if summoned by the ancient magic of the house itself. Beyond it, only deeper darkness awaited. A darkness that called to them both. They had broken one chain. But to truly escape, they would have to face what lay beyond. The heavy stone door yawned open, revealing a corridor swallowed by darkness. It was not a natural blackness, but something deeper, something that seemed to devour even the memory of light. Elisa tightened her grip on Sophie's hand. They stepped over the threshold. Instantly, the tomb behind them vanished. No turning back. The corridor walls were rough-hewn stone, slick with moisture, and the air grew colder with each step. Faint whispers floated along the passage, voices just beyond the edge of understanding. Elisa could see nothing ahead, but somehow her feet kept moving, as though drawn by an invisible thread. Suddenly, Sophie spoke, her voice clear in the oppressive dark. "They're watching us again, Mama." Elisa's heart thudded painfully in her chest. "Who, Sophie?" The little girl pointed into the void. All at once, pale faces materialized in the stone, frozen in silent screams, eyes wide with terror. They lined the walls like grotesque mosaics, mouths open as if eternally begging for mercy. Elisa forced herself not to look at them. If she faltered, if she hesitated, she knew she would become one of them. The passage twisted and turned, growing narrower. Finally, after what felt like hours, they stumbled into a cavernous chamber. At the center stood an enormous well, ringed by crumbling statues. Each statue depicted a figure in agony, some clawing at invisible enemies, others covering their faces in despair. The well itself was choked with mist, swirling with a strange silver glow. Above it, suspended in mid-air, floated a mirror. It was ancient, framed in blackened iron, its surface cracked in spiderweb patterns. Elisa felt her throat dry. Something about the mirror pulled at her, whispering promises of answers, of escape, if only she would look. Sophie whimpered. "I don't want to, Mama." Neither did Elisa. But something deeper than fear pushed her forward. She approached the mirror, heart pounding, and peered into it. At first, there was only her reflection, gaunt, pale, eyes wide with terror. But then the surface rippled. A different scene emerged. She saw a room she recognized, the parlor of the house above, but twisted, rotten. The furniture sagged with mold, the walls wept black tears, and at the center of it all stood a cradle, rocking slowly. Alone. Inside the cradle, something stirred. Elisa gasped as a tiny hand, pale and skeletal, reached out. The vision shattered. The mirror cracked further with a deafening screech, and from the misty well below, something began to rise. It was a figure, emaciated and crawling, dragging itself upward with hands that were barely flesh and bone. It had no face, only a gaping black maw where features should have been. Sophie screamed. Elisa grabbed her daughter and turned to run, but the cavern shifted around them. Walls bending, ceiling lowering, the statues creaking as they twisted to watch. The mirror pulsed with dark energy, a heartbeat that echoed through the chamber. There was nowhere to run. Elisa spun back towards the well. The figure had fully emerged now, standing upright. It reached a hand towards her, and though it had no eyes, she knew it was looking directly into her soul. And in a voice like the breaking of bones, it spoke. "You cannot leave without surrendering the truth." The cavern trembled violently. Chunks of stone rained from above, the statues cracked and fell, and the mist thickened until it clung to Elisa's skin like oil. Sophie was crying now, clinging desperately to Elisa's waist. Elisa looked at the mirror again, the cracked glass reflecting dozens of versions of herself, each one slightly wrong. One wept blood. One stood still with hollow eyes. One smiled with a mouth full of broken teeth. The words of the book flashed in her mind. To break the chain, reveal the hidden guilt. She clenched her fists. She knew then, the house, the tomb, the darkness, they fed on secrets, on the sins people buried so deep they no longer dared to speak them aloud. If she wanted to escape, she would have to give it what it wanted. Her voice broke as she whispered into the churning mist. "I left him." The shadows paused. "I left my baby. I let him die." The mist recoiled for a moment, as if shocked by her confession. The faceless figure hissed, the mirror cracked again, and the ground beneath the well shuddered violently. But still it was not enough. The darkness wanted more. It demanded the whole truth. The moment hung suspended, breathless. And then Elisa, trembling, dug deeper into the memory she had locked away for so long. She screamed into the void. "I was afraid. I ran. I let the fire take him." The chamber exploded in light. The statues shattered, the mist screamed as if alive, and the mirror burst apart, shards flying in every direction. The faceless figure shrieked and was dragged back into the well, clawing at the air in futile desperation. Elisa collapsed to her knees, clutching Sophie. Around them, the cavern began to crumble. A doorway formed where the mirror had been, glowing faintly with golden light. Without hesitation, Elisa picked up Sophie and ran. The darkness howled behind them, furious and hungry, but they did not look back. They plunged through the door. And into blinding white. The world beyond the door was not what Elisa expected. No sunlight, no fresh air. Only a vast endless field of white mist stretching into eternity. She stumbled forward, clutching Sophie to her chest, her legs trembling from exhaustion and fear. Behind them, The golden doorway sealed shut with a soft sigh, vanishing into the mist. There was no way back. For a long moment, nothing happened. Elisa stood still, listening to the silence, her heart pounding in her ears. Then, from the mist ahead, a figure began to take shape. It was not the faceless horror from the well. It was a man. Tall, gaunt, dressed in a simple gray coat, his eyes hollow yet piercing. Elisa's breath caught in her throat. She knew him. It was Henrik, her husband, the father of the child she had abandoned. Henrik approached, his steps soundless on the unseen ground. His face was lined with grief, his gaze heavy with accusations Elisa could not bear to meet. "You left him," Henrik said, his voice as soft as falling ash. Elisa shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I was scared. I was so scared." Henrik stopped a few feet from her. "You chose yourself," he whispered. "You chose to survive." Sophie clung tighter to Elisa. The mist swirled around them, whispering echoes of her guilt, her fear, her shame. Elisa fell to her knees. "I would have died with him," she sobbed. "I could not save him. I could not save myself." Henrik knelt before her. For the first time, his expression softened. "It was not your fault," he said. "You were just a girl, trapped in something you could not fight." Elisa looked up, hope flickering in her tear-streaked face. "But now," Henrik continued, his voice firm, "you must choose." The mist around them thickened, coiling like serpents. Two paths formed before her feet. One path led back into darkness, back to the tomb, to the endless punishment of guilt. The other led forward, into a faint golden light, a future she could still claim, if she dared to forgive herself. Henrik stood and extended his hand. "Leave it behind," he urged. "Take Sophie and live." Elisa hesitated, her heart torn. She felt the weight of her past pulling at her, dragging her backwards. But then she looked at Sophie, innocent, terrified, depending entirely on her. She made her choice. Gripping Sophie's hand tightly, Elisa took a trembling step towards the light. The mist hissed and shrieked in protest, clawing at her clothes and hair, but she pushed forward. Henrik smiled, a sad, proud smile. As she passed him, he faded into mist, his face the last to disappear, carrying a forgiveness she never thought she deserved. The golden light grew stronger, warmer, until it enveloped her completely. The howling darkness behind them was swallowed up, and silence fell. Elisa stumbled, blinking, and found herself standing once more outside the old house. The sky above was gray but clear. The cursed estate behind her was nothing more than a ruin now, crumbling and lifeless. Sophie clutched her side, wide-eyed but alive. They were free. For the first time in what felt like forever, Elisa drew a deep, shuddering breath. She knelt and hugged Sophie tightly. "We made it," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. Sophie nodded, her little arms wrapping around Elisa's neck. The past would never leave her entirely. But now it would not control her. Hand in hand, they walked away from the ruins, stepping into whatever life still awaited them. And behind them, the mist curled one last time, before disappearing into the earth forever.